It's well known that the Great USA has great carriers, the world's greatest aircraft carrier series, the U.S. Nimitz-class nuclear-powered carriers. The lead ship will now retire in 2026. The second ship turns 50 in 2027, and its service life is ending. The successor, the Ford-class, is in its second formal deployment in Europe after a very long deployment. It is estimated the second ship, the Kennedy, will take more than 16 years to be delivered to the Navy. In other words, today, if we don't count the Nimitz that is on its farewell deployment, the U.S. Navy's true combat-ready carriers are only the Ford, the Washington, and half of the Nimitz, for a total of 1.5 Nimitzes and 1 Ford. Why has the Nimitz-class, the workhorse and backbone of the U.S. Navy, met such a tragic fate after 40 years of service and several rounds of extremely long deployments? Today we'll take a deep dive into the issues of carrier deployment and maintenance. Currently, the U.S. Navy temporarily has the largest carrier fleet in the world. However, this is facing some strange changes. The first batch of Nimitz-class carriers are now entering their final phase. The lead ship, the Nimitz, is over 50 years old and nearing its last years, scheduled for retirement in 2026 and heading for its demise. The eighth ship, the Eisenhower, entered service in 1977 and is now 48 years old, in its knowledge of destiny years. At this rate, the U.S. Nimitz-class aircraft carriers can proudly call themselves frontline elderly veterans. And as the Nimitz-class replacement, the Ford-class lead ship, the Ford, has announced its combat readiness. It conducted its first combat deployment and participated in exercises in the North Atlantic. But if you ask if the Ford can be used for war now, to achieve a truly combat-ready deployment, to be used as a complete carrier, Orange Cat would hesitate. The U.S. Navy would also hesitate, and so would Lockheed Martin, the maker of the F-35. So what's going on? Let's take a look. In the words of the Pentagon, there is not enough data and reliability has not significantly improved. The report for the 2019 fiscal year still shows that funding has not been obtained for testing many core systems. Our old friend, the GAO, explicitly stated that multiple projects that matured after being moved forward still have structural flaws in their product maturity, test thoroughness, and reliability validation. The 78 and 79 are both included, with core new technologies continuing to bring risks to cost, schedule, and readiness. The C2S also raised issues with the reliability, completion, cost, schedule delays, and hull weld problems of the Ford-class aircraft carrier, requesting further inquiry and follow-up from Congress. The subsequent Navy 2025 fiscal year budget postponed the procurement of the fourth ship, CVN-82, from its original delivery in 2028 to 2030, which will further slow the pace of the industrial chain and increase risks. What can I say? The subsequent ships are all being delayed to the point of creating a spectacle. If CVN-81, the Miller, really entered service in 2023, then in these 3 years, we would have CVN-79, 80, and 81 entering service. Wow, the US is strong. And the only ones who truly believe this stuff is reliable in terms of timing are probably the Newport News commissioners and the stubborn users. But then again, the Ford status is actually considered good because at least it participated in a major exercise and was deployed once. So what's worse than the Ford class? Only the Ford class itself. The second Ford class ship, the JFK, had its steel cut on February 25, 2011. It was originally planned to be launched in 2018 and delivered to the U.S. Navy in 2024. Construction took 7 years, fitting and sea trials 6 years, with the entire construction cycle reaching a staggering 13 years. The planned construction cycle was 13 years, so the time given to the shipyard by the U.S. was extremely generous. According to the original records of the U.S. Navy NAVGAN HSC, a Nimitz-class carrier generally takes 4 years to build, 3 years for fitting and sea trials, for a total of 7 years to be delivered and enter service with the U.S. Navy. For example, the last Nimitz-class carrier, the Bush, had its steel cutting ceremony on September 6, 2003, and was in service by January 10, 2009. And for the first carrier to be started 2 years after the Bush, the U.S. Navy generously doubled the construction cycle. At this point, you, the audience, might as well tap the like, share, and subscribe buttons for a triple combo. But even so, the construction cycle of the ill-fated second Ford-class ship, the Kennedy, is still not great. When it was in the dry dock, it could be considered normal. It took 8 years from the start of construction to launch. It was launched on October 29, 2019, only about a year late. It could be called slightly exceeding the plan, falling into the category of not a big problem. So where is the big problem? After the Kennedy entered the fitting process, things started to go wrong. A few days after it was launched, and after the USS Richard got well done at about 8:50 a.m. on July 12, 2020, our esteemed JFK also had a little fire during fitting at about 10:15 a.m. on July 20, 2020. Its originally scheduled service date of 2022 was naturally out of the question, and so the Kennedy was rescheduled for service in July 2025. However, in July 2025, as this script is being written, the Kennedy was unsurprisingly delayed. The new statement is that the Kennedy is not expected to be delivered for service until 2027. This means the entire construction cycle will reach 16 years. The Kennedy hasn't even had sea trials yet, so the question is, how much time does it have left? 2 years. So, do you think there's hope for the Kennedy to complete the remaining fitting work and the sea trial process in such a tight schedule? You should know, this is the USA in 2025, the US military in 2025, and US shipyards in 2025. Of course, if you think the Ford class is taking so long to build because it has too many new, powerful subsystems, let's look at some data from the real Minra. How many years did it take to build the world's first nuclear-powered warship, the undisputed US supercarrier Enterprise? Its keel was laid in 1958, it was launched in 1960, and it entered service at the end of 1961. That's right, the entire construction cycle from keel to service was less than 4 years. If you don't yet grasp how absurd the Kennedy's 16-year construction cycle is, let's find a comparison. From a major Eastern country, the first domestically produced aircraft carrier. Oh, that's right, the Vikram. This Indian aircraft carrier, which was launched 3 times, began construction around 2006, was launched for the 3rd time in 2015, which took about 9 years, began sea trials in 2018, and entered service in 2022. It took exactly 16 years. Doesn't this sound familiar? Both have a 16-year construction cycle, except the Indian Navy has already finished building their carrier in 16 years. In the US Navy, they are only expected to finish in 16 years. Yes, expected. How does that saying go? Question your dad, understand your dad, become your dad. Well, the US Navy has officially reached the point of becoming their dad. I've gone off topic. Let's get back to the main point. According to US Code Title 10, Section 8062, the Naval Combat Force should include not less than 11 mission-capable aircraft carriers and not less than 31 mission-capable amphibious warfare ships, of which not less than 10 should be amphibious assault ships. The Nimitz-class USS Nimitz will be retired in May 2026, and the second Nimitz-class ship, the Eisenhower, will also reach its theoretical lifespan of 50 years in 2027. If it is also retired on schedule, even if we assume the Kennedy enters service on time, then in this situation of 2 retired, 1 supplemented, the US Navy would only have 10 aircraft carriers on paper. And it's highly likely that the Kennedy's service in 2027 will follow the same path as the Ford, where service means it is technically in service but not combat ready. In that case, the US Navy would likely have 10 carriers for show, but only 9 that are truly capable. If we take a more pessimistic view, and if the Ford is still in that ghostly state, having passed IOC, but not yet FOC, then you'd have to subtract another one. Then we can take a look at the carriers queuing up at the entrance of the Newport News shipyard. The refueling process for the Stennis has been stretched to 5.5 years. The Truman is preparing for refueling, and the Reagan is preparing for an incremental repair in the dry dock. The Eisenhower is in need of a PIA because it has been used for so long, and the Roosevelt will also need a PIA after its long deployment, while the Nimitz is preparing for retirement. It's a real changing of the guard situation. But if you ask me, Orange Cat, not having enough carriers isn't necessarily a bad thing. The legal provisions can be flexibly defined according to Mr. Smith. The number of U.S. carriers is like this. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2006, Section 126, for the first time legally mandated a minimum of 12 carriers. In 2007, it was lowered to 11, and between 2012 and 2017, it was temporarily lowered to 10 with an exemption. So lowering it a bit more to 7, 8, or 9 is not out of the question. That being said, while the number of carriers is flexible, it doesn't mean your health standards, my dear audience, are flexible. And speaking of health, we must talk about maintenance. 12 short repairs lasting 3 months without entering dry dock, 6 in-dock repairs lasting 5.5 months, and 5 major overhauls lasting more than 18 months. In this mode, a nuclear-powered carrier is unavailable for at least 35% of its total service life. Some ships have an even higher percentage. For example, the Nimitz had a maintenance ratio of 42% in its first 10 years of service, which severely weakened the fleet's sustained readiness and global deployment capability. To meet the demands of high-intensity, multi-area combat rhythms after the Cold War, the U.S. Navy began implementing an incremental repair plan in 1997. In this maintenance cycle, to put it simply, a carrier is used for 18 months, then enters dry dock for 6 months of rest, and is then used for another 18 months.